Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Rausan Pereira. The Prime Minister's office today ordered the Information and Broadcasting Ministry to withdraw its press release on fake news, holding that the decision on what constitutes fake news should be left to press bodies. According to a PTI report, the Prime Minister's office felt that the government should not interfere in the matter. A day after it brought out a set of stringent measures to deal with fake news, the INB ministry withdrew them on Tuesday after the direction from the Prime Minister's office. The ministry had on Monday announced measures to contain fake news, saying a journalist's accreditation could be permanently cancelled if he or she is found generating or propagating fake news. The guidelines drew a sharp reaction from the opposition and several journalists. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyse if we need guidelines to deal with fake news. Joining me on the programme today are Satya Prakash, legal editor of the Tribune, Abhigyan Prakash, senior executive editor of NDTV India, Nitin Desai, member News Broadcasting Standards Authority, and Sushant, Sareen, senior fellow, Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Desai, I'd like to begin with you, of course. What prompted the INB ministry in the first place to come out with these set of guidelines or, the order?
I have no capacity to speak of what prompted the INB ministry. I'm here, I suppose, representing a viewer interest. I'm a member of the National Broadcasting Standards Authority as an independent member, a non-editorial member. And so, in a sense, what we are concerned with is what I can talk about is why the NBSA was set up, what are its standards of accuracy, impartiality, objectivity that it has. But I have absolutely no idea what goes on in the...
So let's talk about fake news then on the whole. As a viewer, as an independent member, how widespread is the issue?
I would not be able to give you a number as to how it is widespread. I wish one could. I think the real test is how much diligence is exercised by channels before they put news out. This is the thing that is reflected in the guidelines here. The guidelines that have been approved and agreed by the members of the National Broadcasting Association, of which has constituted this NBSA, do talk in terms of new verification. Let me give you an example, for instance, a non-political example, just to be clear. For instance, we've had issues. Somebody says that, oh, this news was announced on this channel about such and such company declaring a bonus, and half an hour later it was announced that there's no such bonus, and in that time the share price went up and down, and it's very possible that this was manipulated and somebody made money out of it. So the standard we want to try to impose there is, first, disclosure. Please inform if any of the people involved in putting this news out have a stake in that particular company. Second, due diligence. Did somebody pick up the phone and talk to the company before you put that news out? So that is a standard. Third is, which does not apply in this case, but in other cases, when you're talking, let's say, about a hospital or something, did you go and ask those people before you said they have been doing these things? Did you give them an opportunity to put their point of view? And then they have to show that they made an effort. They may well have a situation where they did not get a response, but they have to show that they made an effort. Now, I think we have been reasonably successful in imposing, and not imposing, but in getting people to live to this standard, which is verification. If you're talking about somebody specific as an institution, did you go and talk to those people and ask them? And basically, the way this has been done is to say, if you did not do it, then you must give them an opportunity.
Sure.
In that same time slot to give their point of view.
Okay.
If you made a mistake, then you must put a correction at the same time prominently. And these are the types of things that self-regulation can do.
Sure, right. Satya Prakash, these rules and regulations are all in place, as far as dealing with mistakes, dealing with fake news, call it whatever you want to call it. Are these guidelines followed?
Well, in the first place, there are no rules or regulations. The Press Council of India, which has the mandate of regulating the print media, it's a toothless tiger, first. Second, so far as NBA is concerned, it does not have any statutory backing. So it's so-called independent or self-regulatory body. And whether self-regulation is the best form of regulation or not, that's debatable. The third and the largest, the most important point is we have a habit of jumping the gun. We have allowed the entire electronic media industry to flourish without putting in place the necessary regulatory mechanism. And that's where the problem lies. The current set of problems we are facing, it's mostly about electronic media. Of course, there are instances of fake news in the print medium also, but mostly about electronic media. And the unfortunate part is that we have a self-regulatory body, and there are instances where a member of that body has refused to obey the orders or whatever instructions were issued by the NBA. So the real problem lies in the lack of regulation. We can have a debate whether self-regulation is good or government regulation is good, or there is a requirement to have a mix of both. But there is a need to have regulation, and the problem of fake news is a real problem we are facing. Whether and how it should, whether it should be dealt with is not the question. How it should be dealt with is the real question.
Okay.
And there is a need to have debate. And certainly, of course, I am saying that all the stakeholders should be there. But government is a necessary stakeholder.
Okay, the government is a necessary stakeholder is what you're suggesting. It's a major problem. It needs to be dealt with. Abhigyan, Prakash, how do we deal with it?
See, there are two things which is very clear. One, don't generalize. Wherever you have mechanism to identify that there are incidents of fake news, address that. Don't generalize. You can't come out with a situation where you say, okay, we will revisit the accreditation of journalists, even cancel them. Don't do that. Identify. You live in the age of social media. Identify where the problem is. And all bodies have to come together. I frankly don't know how much it has been done on this in the past. But as I said, you're living in the age of social media. These problems were bound to happen. So address it. Don't generalize. Don't do the CBSE situation that, all children will have to give re-examination. Then you'll have to take that decision back. Secondly, if you manage to identify, you will end up not questioning everyone else as a journalist. I'm on a very clear and a firm opinion always that as far as regulation is concerned, it has to be done within the media. Done by those who are in the media. This is a serious problem. Media is facing enormous credibility crisis, unlike a lot of situations in the past. So you do that, because if you don't do that, then in some way or the other, you'll end up allowing governments to come and control it in some form or the other, and no political party is different
but
in
that's
that.
happening any which ways, through advertising, through some mean or the other, the government or
Agreed.
or a
Agreed.
big MNC is already
made the point.
Yeah.
Agreed, because obviously television has grown at a phenomenal pace without understanding the bad economics behind it. I've made these points a lot of times in the past. So you are already living in that situation. What is little left of you, don't let go of that also. You fight for that. That's very, very important. Otherwise, you in any case have commercialization. As he pointed out, that you have instances where somebody can say, okay, based on X news, some company ended up making money. So you have already these problems. So look within yourself. That is very important. And the structures should identify fake news or its players and book them and not generalize it. No, that's not the solution.
Okay. Sushant, Sareen, self-regulation or government regulation?
It has to be a mix. But I don't see how self-regulation has worked so far. I would be very interested in knowing instances within newspapers and television channels where if they have self-regulating mechanisms, then they've actually taken action against people who've peddled fake news. I haven't seen much instance of that. In fact, there are many people who've been tweeting fake stuff or jumping the gun and tweeting stuff and then not even apologizing for what they have done. Little realizing that, because of their profile, the impact which one of their fake tweets will have is a lot more than what anybody else. If you or I do it, it won't have the same impact. We've had newspapers which have jumped the gun. For example, the Hindu case where there was this molestation during that stampede kind of a thing.
In Bombay.
Yeah. Now, where was the self-regulation? What was the action which was taken? I haven't seen anything. That is one point. The second point is, this business of self-regulation, see, the media is not cut off from rest of society. It's part of the society. It's part of the entire legal and other frameworks of this country. For the media or for any other institution to insist that, look, laws can apply to other people, they don't apply to us, I don't see how that works. So maybe there has to be a case where you cannot just put out whatever news you get without, as Mr. Desai is saying, due diligence. We've seen a case, although that's a political case, but that was fake news which was being peddled by a politician, and now we see he's apologizing. Every second day he's going and apologizing to people and saying that, listen, I was fed fake news. Now the point is, where was the due diligence? And why shouldn't those defamation laws, because you have already painted a guy as a devil in front of everybody, and then 6 months later, after you see that you might be losing a particular case, you say, okay, I apologize. I don't see how that is good enough.
Sure.
So maybe there is a case for legal reforms, and yes, to the extent that newspapers or media organizations ensure that there is a very robust regulation mechanism within those organizations, and they take people to task for either jumping the gun or pushing an agenda, unless of course the news organization's agenda itself is very clear, and I have no problems with that.
Right.
But other than that, people pushing individual agendas of the sorts Mr. Desai has spoken about, I'm sure you have to come down on them like a ton of bricks.
Indeed. You have to come down on them like a ton of bricks is what you're suggesting. But the bigger question, Mr. Desai, is how easy or difficult is it really to identify fake news and deal with it?
I'd say that basically mainly what I have experienced over the years that I've been involved is that the best identifier of this fake news are the people who are hurt by it. They are the ones who come to you and say, that man uttered a lie about me.
But by the time that person raises an issue and it comes and, it goes to a court and the damage has already been done.
No, if the damage, remember this, that there are existing laws on defamation. There's an IPC. All of that will continue to apply. The defamation laws continue to apply. Let me just mention something on the whole question of self-regulation versus government. I can do no better than what the NBSA guidelines, and I will forgive me, it is the duty of the media to keep the citizenry informed of the state of governance, which mostly puts it at odds with the establishment. A media that is meant to expose the lapses in government and in public life cannot obviously be regulated by government. It would lack credibility. It is a fundamental paradigm of freedom of speech that media must be free from government control in the matter of content. Censorship and free speech are sworn enemies. This is the foundation of the idea. The important thing is, how do you make self-regulation work? I believe that what has been contemplated here is essentially a type of peer pressure. Remember this, that these people who are, and I've noticed one thing. What I've noticed is that within the body, I don't see a great difference between the views on particular cases being expressed by independent members like me and by the editors. They have the same, they also say, my God, this is wrong. It should never have been done. Is quite often the reaction I get from the editors. So in that sense, this is the only way to build in a certain sense of responsibility in the people who are there. There are other things also we need to do better. One thing I must say, they need better training. And what's the difference between arrest and detention? What's the difference between an allegation and those things have to be done. I mean, there are a lot of these sort of youngsters who are not always very familiar with this terminology, with these things. So there are things which they need to do on training. The problem in media, electronic media, is the sheer pressure of 24/7 news, the TRP pressures. There was always a standard in print media of two sources. The standard in the print media was always that you don't put out a story unless you have two sources. Now, a two-source-based system is a little difficult to apply in a 24/7 media which is continuously being fed. So there are difficulties, and one of the things that maybe media people have to do is a little bit more of scrutiny on how is a story filtered before it gets in. Who writes those? Quite often the problem is not the story. The problem is that banner at the bottom.
Yeah.
Quite often the problem is the sort of exaggerated banner at the bottom. So these are things that they will certainly need to do. But I do believe that basically if you want a free media and a responsible media, then you have to start at the self-regulation end. You need both.
Sure. Sure. Yes, Abhigyan, Prakash.
There are 2 points I quickly want to make. One, when Sushant mentioned about tweets. Firstly, understand that fake news, which everybody here is identifying, is a serious problem. That is to be dealt with separately. Then there are people who are providing opinion on different platforms. Okay. Now, don't mix that up. People who are providing opinion will have to stand by their opinion. And if need be, as we have a case in front of all of us, apologize. And it should happen. That's point number 1. Point number 2, I agree with what Mr. Desai is saying. So a lot of people, when they go to the organizations or seminars, are being very blunt here, everybody talks very politically correct thing, very morally and ethically correct thing. But when they go back to the newsrooms, it is not implemented. See, very serious problem because of the demand and supply equation. You've got a whole lot of people who are very young, inexperienced, getting the opportunity that may be too early for them. So they're not being able to understand the pressure. So just in the system of standing and giving out gyan on some kind of a live situation, what you're actually giving away could be totally different. And there's no mechanism yet within the systems to control that. So see, these are very systematic operational problems which only the organizations within themselves will have to address and will be able to address.
You know, that's something that Satya Prakash said in his opening statement itself, that, you know, several opportunities have been given. There are, you know, there are probably many times that, you know, the NBA and the PCI could have stepped in and done something, but they haven't done it. Self-regulation has not really worked, Satya Prakash. So, you know, in this particular case, where we don't have any legislation to deal with this problem, we don't have any set guidelines, set rules, is it time then to bring about a law to deal with the problem?
Before I come to your question, there are 3 aspects. One is quite often, particularly for electronic media, it's quite often a bargain between accuracy and speed. So they are under tremendous pressure to break stories. So quite often, truth is casualty, and it has happened in many cases. One. Second is, there are certain aspects of law. So far as print media is concerned, there is PCI, though it's a toothless tiger, it hardly has any powers. Third is, there are certain aspects of ethics, journalistic ethics. And relating to that is the moral authority exercised by either PCI or NBA. Coming back to your question, whether there should be regulation or not, there is no question of having no regulation. There has to be regulation. As I pointed out in the beginning, it can be either government regulation or self-regulation or a mix of both. The fourth could be even the self-regulation, which NBA kind of body is exercising, even that can have a statutory backing. It doesn't have any statutory backing. It is not based on a law.
You know, PCI is a statutory body at the end of the day.
PCI is a statutory body, but it doesn't have those powers. There was a suggestion made by Justice Markandeya Karju in 2012 when he was the PCI chairperson. He said the PCI's jurisdiction should be extended over the electronic media and the social media. And the government did not react to that, and the proposal is still pending with the government, maybe gathering dust. But there is a need to consider all those proposals. We can have a separate body. We can extend the jurisdiction of the PCI. But to say that only self-regulation will work, it's debatable, and let's have a debate, and we are having a debate. But self-regulation, so far as my understanding is concerned, it has not worked. And there is even if you want self-regulation, it must have a statutory backing. Otherwise, nobody will obey your directions. So there is a need to have regulation first. Whether it should be government regulation, most of us are against purely government regulation. Either it can be self-regulation with statutory backing or a mix of government and self-regulation.
Sure.
But there is a need for regulation that goes without
Okay,
saying.
there is a need for regulation at the end of the day. How we regulate, is debatable, is what you're suggesting. Sushant, if you talk about social media, that's something that we've not spoken about. We've spoken about print, we've spoken about broadcast media. Social media, brings out something new altogether. How do we deal with that problem?
Yeah, I think that's the question with which countries around the world are grappling with, states and societies, even companies are grappling with. But I just want to come back to the previous one. This business, while I agree that there are these pressures, and as Satya Prakash is saying that, accuracy and, the speed.
Racing against time, yes.
Yeah, that cannot become an excuse. That has been used as an excuse for peddling nonsense, right? Now, if that requires that there has to be either regulation or there has to be legislation, then I don't see, because it will be the same for everybody. It does not necessarily mean that it's the government which is cracking down or censoring. To insist that news organizations do not publish false news, I don't see how anybody can have a problem with that. So if the news organizations can regulate themselves very well, but if there is some legislation to ensure that there are heavy penalties which will be imposed if they step out of line, or they do, or they peddle stories which are palpably fake, then I don't see why there should be a problem. And if it is the same for, if the judges will decide, the legal system will decide. It's not some joint secretary who will decide that, but it will be a proper legal process. Now, what that legal process can be worked out. What the legislation can be worked out, and I don't see why anybody should have a problem with that. On the social media, again, I think the dangers of social media are very visible now, because a lot of fake news is actually peddled on social media. Pictures from Nigeria are morphed and then shown that it was in some place in India where riots are taking place.
And social media is faster than the broadcast media.
Social media is faster. Now, the social media also has a good point that a lot of information exchanges very fast. People get aware of it. But then that same medium is used for peddling fake news, for clearly fake news with an agenda. Now, similar legislation needs to be for social media as well. But again, if I criticize the Prime Minister of the day or the leader of another party, either in a state or at the center, then my criticism should not become a reason to persecute me. However, if I am morphing pictures and I am peddling those fake pictures of either riots or of some news item which is clearly designed to cause unrest, to incite hatred, then I see no reason why there should be equally stiff legislation for that, and strict action should be taken against people who either start that particular trend, whether it's a WhatsApp message or whatever else, or who are peddling that.
Sure.
I think that kind of a deterrence has to be built into the system if you want to remain a somewhat sane society.
All right, quick closing comments now from all my guests, starting with you, Mr. Desai. Yeah.
I would say that basically do not underestimate the importance of responsibility within the media. Let me give one small example of the type of manipulation of news. There was a period once in Bombay when this political organization was staging attacks. They would actually, it would only take place in one place. They would ask the media houses, come there. The media houses would take those things, it would go out, and the impression would be generated that it's happening all over Bombay. The news editors of the media organizations got together and said, we're not going to fall for this. And they stopped going. And the fellow has stopped. See, now this is an example of where, if they act responsibly, if they say, we are not going to be manipulated, I'm not going to agree to be manipulated, and they agreed together, so that the TRP business was left to one side. They said mutually they agreed. And part of the thing that self-regulation does is encouraging this type of getting together of people. For instance, we got together the business editors before we got the guidelines down on these operations. On the social media, let me just quickly say one thing. The problem there is distinguish between curated news sites, where the person who's curating it has to accept responsibility. Second is the news sites which are like run by the Facebooks and Twitters. And there my answer is you must hold them responsible.
Yeah.
You hold a bookseller responsible if he sells a pornographic piece of literature, right?
Right.
He cannot say, I didn't write it. Can he say that? No. You selling it, you are very responsible. And I would say, I would tell the Facebooks and Twitters who are making money out of all this, that you are responsible.
Sure.
Exactly like a bookseller is.
Sure. Abhigyan.
Two quick points. Totally agree with what Mr. Desai is saying. As Sushant pointed out, it's very, very big problem. Social media, the reason is very simple, because the costs are so less. So it's not costing you anything. So anybody who's running any kind of domain, go there, identify and fix that person. Because the domain has to be linked to something or the other. So go back, investigate, whatever your IT cells are doing, and fix that person. Just don't keep it, because anybody who runs a site which is supposed to be a business like anything else will then be registered somewhere. So fix that person. And secondly, I'll still repeat the same point. Don't generalize it, because if you go deeply identified pockets and the sockets, you'll be able to figure out who is doing it. And there has to be a larger debate quickly on structuring of identifying wrongs in the social media, because I again repeat, the costs there are very less to cause disturbance.
Indeed. Satya Prakash.
Yeah, the two quick points. First is that we had two press commissions. One was in 1952, J.S. Rajyadhyaksha, immediately after independence, to talk about the role of media, what should be the role of media in the independent India. Second was after the emergency, where during which the relationship between media and government had become internecine relationship. So, and the recommendation was the media should not be an unquestionable ally of the government, or it should not be a mindless adversary of the government. Now is the time to have a third press commission where, because in the last several decades, the media has grown up like anything. We had only print media. Now we have electronic media, social media, online, all sorts of things. So here is the time to assess the entire situation and the needs of the entire industry, electronic, print and online, social media, and accordingly what can be done, what should be done, that should be determined. So there is a need to have third press commission. And finally, even within the existing system, if it is made mandatory for Press Council of India or NBA to force the newspapers or the television channels, if indicted, the indictment news has to be telecast by all the NBA members, or all the newspapers have to publish the indictment news regarding any newspaper which has failed to honor the guidelines. That would act as a deterrent even within the existing system.
All right.
So that should be done.
Sushant, Sareen, close the show for us.
See, fake news is as old as news, right? It's always been there. I think if we start picking on every bit of fake news, then I don't think any news organization can ever exist. I think what we need to concentrate on is, number one, defamation. That if you're going to be defaming somebody by publishing fake news, or if you're inciting hatred of any form, or inciting violence, or trying to create unrest in society. So I think clearly defined parameters have to be there, and within that, anybody who steps out of line, whether you have to do it through legislation, whether you have to do it through some other kind of system, that has to be done. If the news organizations can regulate themselves, very good, but that does not obviate the need for some kind of legislative protection to the people who are very often becoming victims of news organizations. And news organizations cannot use this business of the speed versus accuracy debate as an excuse to actually come out with news which does not hold any water.
All right. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this debate is that fake news is a major problem. It has to be dealt with at the earliest. Whether it is self-regulation or government regulation, of course, remains to be seen. At the end of the day, it has to be regulated, but don't generalize as far as fake news is concerned, is what the panelists here are saying. That's it from me. See you again next time.